Yes, hello, dancetechNet. Johannes Birringer, live from London. We welcome you to our special live stream broadcast today, part of the Brunel Performance Research Seminar Series in the winter of 2011. Today we wanted to introduce Iranian film director Mehdi Farajpour, but unfortunately visa entrance to the UK was denied. We are terribly sorry about this incident. We are lucky though to be able to present composer Phill Niblock, who is in London at the moment visiting the Center for Contemporary and Digital Performance. And we will be introducing a dialogue with the composer Niblock and let you participate in some of the conversations we're having about music, film, performance, time and perception. And I will be excited to mix in some live footage from the concert of Phill Niblock's music here at the Arto Performance Center, a musical performance done in conjunction with a projection of Niblock's film, The Movement of People Working. So please welcome Phill Niblock.
Phill has come to us from Ghent in Belgium, correct? But Phill is an international citizen. He lives in New York some of the time, but he really seems to live most of the time in his car. And I've never known anybody, may I say, of less than tender years who spends so much time driving around the world from gig to gig as Phill does. So there must be very few countries in the world that you haven't played in by now. But
no, it's not true. There are many.
There are many countries in the world that he hasn't.
But I've been in more countries where I actually filmed, where I didn't play.
No, that's a fact for the introvert. So basically, I wanted to do, when I first saw the downstairs Arto studio, the big studio 001, I thought, what a perfect place for a Phill Niblock gig, because it's a huge room. The sound does all kinds of extraordinarily strange things in that space. And I think looking around, almost all of you here probably, with maybe a couple of exceptions, have heard a Phill Niblock gig. So the first thing you'll know about it is that it's loud, and but it's loud for a good reason, not simply to be a kind of vandal, sort of noisy person. But let me ask you that as a question, Phill. Do you like loud sound?
Yes.
Why do you like loud sound? Why aren't you quiet like Morton Feldman?
It doesn't work. Do you want to explain why it doesn't work?
We always do this. We've done some of these conversations. It tends to be me talking for quite a long time, so I apologise in advance. But it's his fault because he doesn't like to talk. But tell me, what
was so bad at 4 o'clock?
He was excellent and eloquent.
Thank you. I stand corrected. Yes.
But maybe I've run out by now. So. And then I think it's up to you.
Okay. Why loud sound?
Because the overtone patterns which emerge when it's loud and not when it's not. You need to explain about the microtonal structure.
I can explain about that, yes. But what is so fascinating about overtones then? And in fact, tell us why. How did you get interested in that kind of strange sonic phenomenon?
I think I must have read a book once or something. It's the only music I've ever had any intention of making since '68. So I set out to make that music, and that was it.
Because before that, we should maybe just sort of briefly recap that. You are unusual for composers in that you didn't grow up with music particularly other than as a listener. I mean, you didn't play an instrument, you didn't study music formally at any stage of your life.
Yes. Well, I took piano lessons for about 6 weeks until my father thought I didn't practice enough, so he fired the piano. Or he fired me, I'm not sure which.
And when you did get interested in sound, how did that come about? And what triggered your interest in listening to sound?
I think I was always interested in sound. I began to collect records in 1948. And since, among other things, I wasn't a musician, I was more listening to sound probably than I was to the typical intellectual stuff that you would be listening to. So, and I tended always to like things which sound.
But in a way, when I think about that, your early interest in jazz would have been coming through from, what, 78s originally?
Yes. Yeah, I began collecting before LPs.
Before LPs. But the sound quality in 78s is not fantastic.
It's true. Actually, the sound quality that's on the 78s, on the masters, is much better than we ever heard. But I think that's also true of LPs, that the sound which is on the tapes from the late 40s sounds much better than the LPs ever sounded.
But getting interested in jazz, did you ever want to learn to play jazz yourself?
No.
Drummer, bass player, pianist, sax
I
player?
have a lousy sense of rhythm. That's the reason I don't use that in rhythm.
And then, just following this little chronology, so you were, I kind of picture you as a young man of sort of 15, 16, being a kind of jazz person. And you went to university initially to study medicine.
Medicine was being an economics major, basically a business major. So.
Right. But why did you get into medicine and why did you get out of medicine?
Well, I got into medicine because I was an idealist, and probably because I thought I would make money. On the other hand, I decided I really couldn't stand sick people. So I thought it was a lousy profession for me.
And then you went into economics, which is what your degree is in.
Yes.
Also to make money?
No, I think just to graduate. I don't think I was ever really interested in making money, ever in my life. There was never a driving force. I probably never said that before.
But was that unusual for a young man in the States in the late 40s not to be interested in making money? I mean, did you come from a very family?
No, I think it's a very individual thing anyway. I mean, people are interested in money or they're not interested in money.
So after that, you had to do your compulsory military service.
Immediately after graduating, I went in the Army as a draftee, a voluntary draftee.
And what did you do in the Army?
I traveled. It was really an amazing experience, actually. I traveled 2 years, all the time. But I was even on duty. So every weekend I went somewhere at least 100 miles away from the base where I was stationed.
Okay. Which was where?
Southern Alabama.
Oh, wow.
You would think anybody would go away from there. It was long before the civil rights movement.
So the cue guitar. Being in the Army obviously wasn't very traumatic for you, because it was for quite a lot of people both beforehand.
Nothing was happening. It was the most boring time to be in the Army you could possibly imagine. There was nothing happening 1956 to 58. Nothing was happening anywhere. It was well after the Korean War, way before the Vietnam War. And the Army had to try to think of things to do, for you to do, you know, march around.
Well, I did wonder what you spent all your time doing in the Army, but perhaps we'll not pursue that line of questioning too far. But
Travel.
Apart from travel, okay, cool.
I went to Europe on leave for a month at the end.
Okay.
So I actually went to Brussels Expo.
No kidding.
Yeah.
The famous Brussels Expo with
Yeah, that one. Yeah, 58.
Oh, okay. So you've got a longer history with Belgium than I realised. But after that, then you headed to New York. That was your big sort of, I suppose, travel decision from that point on.
14 days from the time I left Fort Rucker, Alabama. I was driving up Fifth Avenue,
Wow.
which is a two-way street.
Okay. And why did you go to New
I
York?
drove through the arch. I actually, finally, after a couple of years, I got a job, and I was, the non-job that I had just before that allowed me to buy a camera, which I thought I was going to use in the job, which I got, and I started taking photographs, and that was it.
But I noticed you have a fascination with technology. I mean, if something of mine broke, I might ask you to fix it.
Well, you'll have to do it.
Well, you have a better job, but I mean, you got a sort of fascination with technology, and you got interested in the whole stuff of photography, not just actually the artistic side, but also the technical side of photography.
All of that aspect of photography was extremely easy for me. Yeah. I think the aesthetic side was relatively easy too, but all the stuff that you do with photography, printing, and all of that stuff was easy. So film was also easy to start, but that's pretty simple technology, in any case, compared to now.
Yes.
Compared to Max MSP or something like that.
But I risk of making a sort of really stupid comparison here, which I'm sure I'll regret in a minute I've said it. It strikes me there's something about the way you talking about your interest in photography and your interest in music that is quite similar, in that also in music you're interested in technical things such as microphones and quality of recording and all of that kind of side of things is very much part of how you think about music. So there's a sort of parallel between the two media. Is that stupid or?
Totally true.
Okay.
Or sure.
Sure. Okay, that's the first true out of that.
You're not giving me much opportunity.
But you didn't want to make a career as a photographer? I mean, a longer term career as a photographer?
I wasn't interested in making money. I mean, I think art is probably a hobby for me. It just turned out to be, that's what I did. So.
Okay. Discuss.
Besides being a college professor for 27 and a half years, which I always disliked. So.
But the collection of photographs you made in the 60s included some pretty wonderful pictures of jazz musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never actually quite understood how that came about. Did you do that on a kind of commission for somebody? Were you making portraits for a particular purpose, or was this just that you wanted to hook up with the jazz world again and this was a way of doing it?
No, I was totally enamored. No, it's just because I was interested. And I went to a meeting of the Duke Ellington Jazz Society in 61 or something like that, or late 60, and met this guy who was a recording engineer, who was a really famous collector, particularly of air checks. In fact, his collection went to the Smithsonian as a major part of a collection there. So. And I thought he probably had died 20 years ago, and it turns out he died last March. I missed making contact with him again. And he was very close to Stanley Dance, who was the critic, but also the biographer of Ellington, Basie, and many other people. So, and Dance always knew every Ellington session. And Ellington, I went actually to the last session of Ellington at the Columbia 30th Street Studios, the last session of his contract with Columbia, which was the last contract with a major label until nearly 10 years later when he had, at the end, a contract with RCA Victor, which was an amazing session. I went first to a concert in Long Island where Jerry Valgren was living. The guy was Jerry Valgren. And photographed, and I gave some prints to Valgren and Stanley Dance. And then they started to invite me to the sessions. So sometimes quite late. I mean, I heard about the Ellington, Mingus, and Roach session after it had begun. So I went up there with a very small camera and photographed that session. So.
Yeah. But you ended up, in fact, getting access to some of the great jazz musicians of all time. And yet, you're not attracted as being a pushy sort of guy. So how did you get to photograph? I mean, how did you actually practically get into photography sessions?
Essentially that. I just met this guy and they invited me to a session and I went. And I eventually did have a job working for United Artists. I met the guy at the Ellington, Mingus, and Roach session who was the art director. He said, bring me some prints, so I took some stuff up and then he hired me for a year. And finally he wanted a kickback and I just pretended I didn't understand what he was talking about, and so I got fired. So I had a job for a year and a half as a freelancer. Meanwhile, I was working anyway, a day job, so in a publishing house, so I didn't have a lot of time for that.
So in the 60s then, I mean, apart from the jazz world, you had a little bit of interest also in the sort of avant-garde music world, right? I mean, you talked to me about a concert of hearing the Morton Feldman piece, one of the Durations pieces.
When I came to New York, I was split between hearing classical music and looking for new classical music or new sort of experimental music and jazz. And so I went to both things. I went to a lot of countries.
And what was the hook for you? I mean, because that's, in a way, it's a relatively unusual combination of a jazz lover who also loves James Bond, contemporary music.
When I was collecting music, in the early 50s, I began to listen to a lot of classical music and some few things. There wasn't very much available of anything weird. So there was Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. But there was still stuff around, so I listened to it. I came across as many records as I could. Strange things like Hovanas or something.
Hovanas, I have some of those, yeah. So at that time then, did you feel sort of connected to the whole new emerging, minimal scene with Lamont Young and Tony Conrad and those kind of people who were doing stuff then? Because you knew all those people back then. You went to a couple of gigs.
Well, I was also spending a lot of time going to galleries and to experimental events, films and other kinds of events. So I did know that stuff was happening in Flint.
And did you feel you wanted to be part of that world yourself? Is that where the sort of the music impulse came from?
It came because I began to shoot film working with Elaine Summers, who was a choreographer and herself a filmmaker, who was very much part of the Judson dance movement. And so I started going to Judson and became involved and eventually shot film for a lot of different choreographers.
And then when the first impulse to do music came along, I mean, you told me the story about having this wonderful epiphany one day on your motorbike, riding up a mountain pass.
That was sort of true, but largely bullshit.
Let's hear you guys today. But there was something about that experience, wasn't there, about hearing these two engines, a truck engine and a motorbike engine?
Well, but I think at that time I also knew that phenomenon was there, so I'm not sure where it all fits chronologically. But yeah, so I was very interested in working with tones close together in pitch. So, and maybe not realizing as much how instrument sounds have very rich timbres, so there's a lot of tones out there.
So that realization came a little bit later once you got doing music and became familiar with players?
Yeah, I did a few things with sine waves and stuff like that at the very beginning. Some things with feedback where I was playing with, medium feedback stuff.
Well, where did you do this early experimentation? You didn't have stuff like that at home, I suppose. I mean, did you go into some, did you you have access to studios or to equipment or to?
I had tape recorders and stuff like that.
Okay.
I mean, my first tape recorder was in 1953. So.
Okay.
And there were quite a few at the time, the early 60s, I think. Yeah, so it wasn't, I mean, tape was also something that was very, something that I had, it was part of the repertoire. So that starting to work in tape to record was a pretty natural phenomenon.
And then the earliest music pieces were, I mean, they're not really so much in circulation now. You have some of these pieces that are kind of early experiments, like one with you playing guitar, right?
And that's a weird maverick piece, though. But the first piece was an organ piece, that lesson piece.
Okay.
Where I'm using different registers to get things around tune and
right.
And then I would record people in the studio where I would record them separately so they weren't tuning together.
Right.
And so they were tuned with each other. So, and it was not until a few years later that I really began to tune people very specifically. So the first real tuning piece was in '74 for cello.
And in these early pieces, I mean, what interests me is that we're talking now about, so, okay, the late 60s, so you were already in your mid-30s by that point. Did you have the sense of, you know, hey, I'm becoming a composer, I'm turning into a music person?
Mm-hmm.
Was that the sense you had, that you wanted to sort of...
What, 35 in 2 months. Into first music.
Which is an unusual career path.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just kind of curious to know, was it, I mean, I can't imagine, if I think of myself at 35, starting to do basically a completely new art form for me, with no background, no training. It's kind of, it just blows my mind, the whole thought of it. But obviously, you persevered.
That actually worked pretty quickly that people were hearing music and I was playing it, and I had places to play it because I was doing these performance pieces, etc. So.
Right.
There was also a period in the like 66, 67, 68, where I was working with sort of environments which changed as you move through them, or interactive environments using quite simple photocells and things that shifted. So you move in a certain space, we go from a film and a slide starters. So there was quite a bit of that. And then finally, I simply got to the place where I was doing too much. I was working a full-time job and going to something almost every night and doing a film a week, plus all of that stuff that collapsed. So.
Right. So now around this time then, because the other part of what you do is to, what you've done ever since that time is to create a platform for other artists to show work. So the beginnings of experimental intermedia, which is your foundation that you run, comes from that same time.
The foundation was founded by Elaine Summers in '68, and she invited a number of art. It was the very beginning of the possibility of getting funding from government sources and elsewhere, and you needed a nonprofit organization. So she formed a nonprofit organization, and she invited like 6 artists to be part of that foundation as members who could apply for grants through the foundation.
Right. And
subsequently, it was much more relaxed, so that anybody virtually can apply that I know of. So it was a really good movement, but I always felt that artists should produce other artists, and that we were exceedingly good producers and curators of events. Quite different than the professional curators, particularly like museum curators.
How would you describe the difference? What was the difference between you and the
Well, it's sort of more grassroots. We know artists who were, working and doing interesting stuff, and so that was what we were curating instead of artists who already had some success, basically.
Do you feel that you, as an artist yourself, kind of learned from that experience? I mean, was it an enriching thing for your own work, would you say?
I suppose I couldn't deny it, but I don't really have any particular idea of how. I mean, what's the most thing remarkable about me is that I had these paths that I decided on at one point, and I didn't diverge.
Mm.
So, like, making that music came probably in a 5-minute thought, and then that was it. And the movement of people working came also in an extremely similar way. I thought about it. I defined what I could do in making the films, and I simply did that for 20 years. But I just had to work and go find places to go and get some grants and things like that.
Right.
That was a very rich period.
Yeah. Because in a way that is one of the things that I can't really think of another composer that is similar to you, in the sense that essentially the pieces you make are, on the one hand, superficially they're extremely similar one to the next because they're drums. They don't have tunes or rhythms particularly. And yet you've made now about, I don't know, 50, 60 pieces, something like that. And yet, I mean, what strikes me when I was getting to know your output sort of in great detail sort of over recent years is within that quite constrained field that you set yourself, there's a huge amount of diversity in the pieces, in the sort of sound and the kind of colours of them, in the almost, the emotional states they are in. There's sort of quite a big range. And is this something that, I mean, did you ever think, oh, I should try like a piece in 3 movements, or I should try writing a sort of something else?
A piece for 3 orchestras.
A piece for 3 orchestras. I mean, don't you ever get bored working in a sort of, like, almost all your pieces are 23 minutes long, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some longer. 70 minutes for one.
Yes, sure, yes.
No. The answer is no. Not sure, but no. But I'm extremely happy that you see the diversity.
Sure.
Being my chief critic.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even just playing the
My
pieces.
chief constructive critic.
No, that's pretty apparent. But I mean, I suppose, okay, I have 2 questions. One is, why 23 minutes? I mean, it's an odd kind of length. It always feels to me, because having played quite a lot of your pieces now, they've all been either 22 or 23 minutes. I mentally can get up to about 17 minutes and feel 17, 18 minutes and feel it's a something. But always the last stretch of your pieces feels to me like, oh, there's still quite a long way to go. There's some weird kind of cut-off point in my brain that stops somewhere around 17, 18 minutes. Well, that at least wants to make a punctuation.
Well, maybe that's an aberration on your part.
I don't know.
The ideal length for a very full-bodied but undistorted piece on an LP side was 23 minutes.
Didn't think of that.
But I thought it was an extremely natural length myself. I mean, it does work. So.
Yeah. Take the piece we're going to hear tonight. So we're going to play Tulips, and then at the end we're going to play Disseminate. How do you go about making these pieces?
I think you've asked me a terminal embarrassing question. I'm not sure how I can answer it. Most pieces that 5 minutes of inspiration are the comma. So I sit and suddenly something comes and it gels in about 5 minutes, and that's it. Then if I write it down, I maybe make it, and if I don't, then I forget it. So there are many pieces I've forgotten. So.
And when you say that something comes, what is it that comes? Is it like an idea about pitch, or is it an idea about a sound, a tone?
I don't know that I can answer that, because I think I've never cataloged that thing. It's just that it's something there, and it falls, it gets more, complicated in the process of the 5 minutes, and some of them probably go further than that.
Do you have pieces that don't work, that you sort of start something and you get stuck, or it's not going anywhere and you kind of throw it away? Because it always seems to me that you don't have that sort of process so much, or do you?
It's rare. Yeah. I almost never revise. There's only a couple of pieces that I actually made revisions of. One piece because I simply didn't like the way it ended, and so I just extended it to
Right.
that. It came closer to 23 minutes. I think it was 17 minutes.
It's just too short.
Obviously, also watching its resolution.
And do you feel you can work with any material? I mean, you've made pieces for most instruments by now, with a few exceptions, but I mean, you made pieces for flutes, clarinets, trumpets, electric guitars, hurdy-gurdy, pianos, bass guitars, cellos, recorders, I don't know, viola, double bass. There's not many you haven't had. Saxophones, didgeridoo, contrabass. Is any instrument usable? Is any you don't like?
I don't know. Another question I can answer.
I wanted to ask about, well, sort of, I'll shut up and throw open the questions to the floor, as I say. But tell me about your future plans. What are you doing now? What are you making now? Because you went back to making films last year, didn't you? I mean more of the...
Some video. Maybe I was course. But there are a few short videos which are quite different from the movement of people working. So doing another set of the movement of people working in 2009 and 10 is sort of extending that, but there are other things which are drastically different. Were done more for an occasion where it was, I needed to do something.
You also have this little sort of quite, almost like a secret category of music, which are these sound pieces that are not, you know, the usual drum.
The sound collages.
Sound collage pieces, yeah. Can you say a bit about that? Because I mean, in some ways that's quite different than you normally do with these very rich musical tones. But you've also made pieces based on the sounds of cars and water and all kinds of...
Well, they're not at all the same kind of pieces, but I'm still interested in sound. So, I think you should ask me a more specific question.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, okay, a very simple thing. I mean, if you work with the sound of a car engine, or you work on the sound of a double bass, is there a basic difference between that, or is it the same sort of...
It would be rare in a double bass where I would change the time of the recording or the pitch drastically. So, but in the sound collage pieces, I'm always working with octaves down, sometimes 3 or 4 octaves down, and layering that way. And for the most part, since they're not pitched at all, then I don't use that microtonal pitch bend.
Right.
So, there are some instruments where the microtonal pitch bends don't work. The piano played with a single strand tied to the piano string. You can make pitch bends all day and don't hear any difference. There's just, there's no clear fundamental.
Okay.
In a way, it's just so twangy that it just doesn't like.
Interesting. Okay. And what is your next music piece going to be? Have you got a new piece in mind? Oh,
I recorded material for a new piece for cello for Arnold Forsyth, but I haven't even listened to the before. It was recorded in Marcus Schmucker's studio in Cologne. I think the sound is really fantastic, but I simply haven't sat down to even listen to the original material since it was recorded. It sounds, it's in that bag.
Oh, okay. We'll make sure we take good care. Would anyone like to ask any questions? Please feel free to ask them all you would want to ask them.
Have we exhausted them and all the questions?
working with, and how was that relationship? Were you just walking into the studios and film process, or were you filming the final pieces? Or?
It was a time when at Judson, every choreographer had to have a film as part of a dance. And so, and I just was the guy who was hanging around, so I became the cinematographer of choice. So I worked with a lot of different people. And I did two different things. Sometimes I would document stuff, and they always hated it. But when I made stuff for a specific project, which was basically just carrying out their idea rather than making it it wasn't my work. I mean, I was just the cameraman, essentially. That always seemed to work. So maybe that was part of what discouraged me about it. Continuing working with dancers.
But still interested in movement?
Well, I'm still interested in movement, yeah. And I was when I was using film material in performance pieces of my own, none of it was with dancers, essentially. It was all some kind of abstract movement. And in that period, I was mostly filming things from nature, which also frequently had its own movement, like water moving or things moving in the breeze.
Actually, I was also curious when you asked the question about going to these Judson concerts. You read about them, or maybe you see a black and white photograph, but what did these concerts sound like? Like, let's say, Yvonne Rainer or Deborah Hay would do something, or whatnot, Simone Forti. What would they use as sound? Do you remember?
But those were concerts that I wasn't involved in.
So when you were working with film and a dancer, was there any music?
It would depend on the piece. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. And it wasn't my thing to do, so I didn't have anything to do with it. So I partly started making music because I had done a couple of things in collaboration with people, and I simply didn't like collaborating. So I decided, well, I had to make the music and get what I wanted without having to screw around with people.
That's interesting. If I may follow up just one small question, because of the way you framed the discussion. In a way, a lot of your questions, to a certain extent, aim at asking Phill as a composer. But I think when you spoke this afternoon about the 60s and you said, I'm an intermedia artist, is it then relevant to ask, again, these questions of addressed to a composer, or is it not, don't we have to ask different questions to an intermedia artist? I'm just curious whether you thought about music in the terms in which maybe a composer thinks, or whether you thought about it very differently.
I think I thought about it in the way a composer thinks about it.
You did.
I mean, I thought about film in the way a filmmaker would think about it, but, you know, in a strange way, but still. Yeah, the intermediate part of it is what happens in the end, or where the ideas go to coalesce. But I don't know that any of the particular media, when they are so developed as that, that you don't think about it as the medium. So, never thought of that.
Well, it's just there is now new literature coming out. I think an Italian guy just published a book on post-media, claiming that we live in a post-medium area where it's no longer relevant to even discuss media, yeah, or distinguish between music or film or visual art. And I guess that's an interesting way to look at the conditions of the media through which we were perhaps growing up or not. Mm-hmm. And it seems that he had a different upbringing from many of us, perhaps, in that sense. Mm.
He's just a wrong thinker, that's all.
Mm. Any other questions? Pieces one after the other straight away, without any pause between hardly. So it's about an hour or just over. The three pieces, in case you want to know the names, are Two Lips, Pour, and disseminate. And I want to introduce the members of the band. The band you see in front of you here are staff and students of Brunel University and a couple of guests. So, very importantly, on the mixing desk we have Johan van der Mallen, who's come all the way from Belgium. So, moving across the circle, Lucy, Alex, myself, where that jacket is, Josh, Jenny, in front of Jenny, James on the flute, Phill, behind Phill, James W. Over here, Harold, Marta, Grace, Eleanor, Hadia, and Ed. And our very special guest, of course, Mr. Niblock himself.